Yes. Hi. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glynn, if you could turn off your screen share for just a second.
Sure.
Hi, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Next up, we have Glynn Dennis, and he is the Senior Director of Data Science and AI at AstraZeneca. And his talk today is entitled Personalizing AI for Human Subjects in Clinical Trials. Please welcome to our virtual stage, Glynn Dennis. Glynn, you can come on out and join us here with your camera on and your slides. And whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Okay, camera's on, mic check.
Sounds good.
Okay, slides sharing. Can you let me know if you see the first slide, please?
Yep, looks great. I'll just turn my camera off, but I'll be here if you need me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Morgan. Hello, everyone. As Morgan mentioned, I'm from AstraZeneca. I joined AstraZeneca about 1.5 years ago, specifically to focus on wearable devices. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, to share with you a little bit of work that we've been doing in that space, in the clinical trial space. And the work I'm going to share with you today was done by a graduate student in my lab. So I always like to start with this, a little bit of context called wearable rocket science. Well, in fact, wearables were rocket science circa 1968. As part of the Apollo program, 7 through 17, where actually the astronauts were outfitted with a biobelt, and they were streaming real-time data. It's about a 2-minute trip for the data, but they were streaming real-time vitals data for the astronauts as they were orbiting the moon. Of course, they couldn't send data from the dark side of the moon, but orbiting the moon, lunar touchdown, extravehicular activities, and then lunar liftoff. And they actually did a lot of the things that we want to do with this kind of data, where they monitor that data, looked at effects of stress, of the stressful situation the astronauts were in, and then made adjustments to future missions based on the data. So very similar playbook in terms of what we want to do in the healthcare space. So the future is bright, and thanks large part to those international space programs. We have cellular satellites, maybe too many of them, but that's a different conversation. All around the globe, GPS for global positioning systems. We have a lot of activity and a lot of development going on in smart clothing and wearable devices. And it seems, everywhere you look, there's another alternative for an activity tracker. The activity trackers are particularly relevant today because of the physical activity monitoring and the 6-minute walk test that we'll be talking about today. So why should we care? I want to talk a little bit about, in a few slides, a little bit about why we care. One is that, as you intuitively understand, physical activity is a pillar of health, and it's actually globally recognized in every nation that physical activity is one of those things that should be monitored and focused on as a clinical practitioner, as well as just a healthy human living a healthy life. So this is just a snapshot from health.gov showing that physical activity is a cornerstone of quality of life and longevity. In fact, if you look at even in 2008, the U.S. government released evidence for the first time that step count has associations with mortality and morbidity. And if you look on the left-hand side, you've got kind of these step recommendations. And I think many of you are, probably have some sort of activity monitor on right now and track your steps. And if you're above 7,500 steps, then you're in pretty good shape. But if you have low step counts, there are strong associations with all-cause mortality over a long period of time, cardiovascular risk, and also diabetes. So this is the context in which we know that step count and physical activity is relevant and important, yet none of the sort of passive monitoring of daily normal routines or physical activity have made it into the clinical trials as acceptable endpoints. Instead, what we still use today is what's called a 6-minute walk test. We use this a lot as an endpoint when we have intervention trials in patients with cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, heart failure, COPD, asthma, those sort of things. And what it is it's this highly structured process. You can see here on the right-hand side, a path of walk. It's about distance of about 30 meters and a turn, and it's on site. Usually a nurse is supervising, and they're coached. The good things about this is that it's non-invasive, it's safe, it's a low patient burden, and it's got a long history of being established and accepted in clinical practice. Even though it's not perfect, it checks a lot of marks in terms of being good for patients and also being meaningful clinically. But if we want to think about what we're trying to do today in terms of the digital health revolution, with the evolution of going from sort of that standard practice to where we have, a long history that dates back also to the mid to late 60s, going from a cardiopulmonary test to a 15-minute walk test to a 12-minute walk test, then to a 6-minute walk test. Sort of the next evolution of that would be, well, let's using the technology that's currently at our hands. And that's done fairly commonly out in the consumer world, but not in the clinical trial world. And we're not the only ones thinking about this. This is from a Nature publication from Apple and Stanford, where they used the 6-minute walk test. They strapped Actigraph and an iPhone on these folks, some analyses. And what I've highlighted here on the bottom is just some of the conclusions about open, is that the built-in algorithms are unable to accurately measure distance, and not too surprisingly. And so we need custom algorithms. And there's more research that's necessary to establish step counting as a clinically meaningful metric. And so those are just two sort of snapshots of conclusions drawn from a recent study. This was done in 2018. There's lots of other work out there in the same space. But the book is still open on how to effectively do this in clinical trials. And so again, what we're talking about specifically today, again, is this evolution from on-site manual functional capacity test called the 6-minute walk test. It's no longer rocket science. It was at once. The technology's there, the algorithms are there. And what we want to do is we want to objectively measure remote and passive daily activity in their routine daily living for quality of, and get an assessment of quality of life. And that's really what the personalized step count is about. So we're unblocking the potential of AI. Really the goal here, as you know, again, we want to take AI, so the black box, and it's the key to the potential of digital health, which is really the pillars are better outcomes, both for patients and also for operationally better outcomes and lower cost, improved clinical experiences, both for the practicing teams, as well as improved patient experience for the patients themselves. It's not so straightforward to do this. There are challenges from lack of large disease-specific data sets. So we have trials that have devices in them, but they're not the kind of data that we need to solve this problem. There's high cost and long lead times. So if you were to design this kind of study, recruiting the patients, designing the study, getting the approvals, collecting all the data, and then validating is a long process. There's also privacy and ethical constraints. We have obviously variability in devices, algorithms, and vendors. And then there's just the normal human heterogeneity confounded by disease and comorbidities. What we are going to remove, bear with me just for a second. I want to see if I can remove this top banner. So what we want to do is we want to start at the beginning, and we're going to focus on raw accelerometer data and raw gyroscopic data as a common denominator. And I want to be specific in the sense of what we mean by raw data. We're not taking step counts as derived from the device itself. Your Fitbit gives you walk 5,000 steps. We're not looking at that data. We're looking at the data that's a layer down that's actually coming off what's called the inertial motion unit, which generates high frequency data in X, Y, and Z triaxial directions. And we're collecting that data 100 times per second. And the reason we want to do that is because then it serves as a common denominator for doing lots of different things. We can summarize that in physical activity, like we can look at moderate to vigorous physical activity. We can look at, how many steps you took. We can look at how many bouts of what was your most active bout during 6 minutes and how much energy did you expend? What was your most active bout for 20 minutes? Human activity recognition or classification into were you sleeping, walking, running, standing, sitting, cycling? And then also distance estimation, so augmentation of, sort of an at-home 6-minute walk test, if you will. And so we have worked and developed algorithms in all of these areas. Specifically today, we're going to talk about step count. So this is the only really technical diagram that you'll see today. So we're using deep learning, like most others are. And again, we aren't doing anything earth-shattering here. We're borrowing from the public domain and literature in terms of what is the current state of the art. And the current state of the art is a long short-term memory deep learning framework, where we're taking, again, 100 hertz sensor data. We're windowing into small windows that are relevant for step counting. And then from there, we can go, if you look on the right side again, those same categories. So daily activity summaries, activity type, step count, and distance. What we're doing here is we're using open source data, and we're doing the typical train test, leave one patient out, cross-validation. And what you see is we get very high accuracy with this. And so I'm going to build out this slide, so that's why it's kind of sparse. But what you'll see on the left-hand side is what I just talked about. So we're using a public data set where they have ground truth. So they were videotaped and manually annotated the steps. We applied the LSTM deep learning, and we get good step class. So is it a left or a right step? And we also get good step count accuracy. And you see that in the cohort 1 in the bar chart, or the dot chart on the right-hand side. So what we wanted to do next is we want to generate more data and so we can ask some more questions. So what if we tried to apply that algorithm to, even though we did train test validation, what if we apply that algorithm to a different set of patients wearing a different device? Also looking at the raw accelerometer and gyroscopic data, but generated with a different device. And so we videotaped volunteers. We generated 25 million sensor readings, 60,000 video frames. We annotated the data, and so now we have a good data set that's got ground truth that we can then test that algorithm on. So again, what you're seeing is what I showed you. This is a build out of that same slide. What you're seeing on the left-hand side was cohort 1, what we talked about, where we had on the dot chart, you have very good accuracy in the golden rod colored dots there. And then in cohort 2 is those separate subjects where we generated new data with a new device, and we applied that algorithm. And what you see in the step count accuracy is that for some patients it's still good, but for some patients it drops dramatically, going down, dipping below 80 and even into below 50, almost 40% accuracy. So what that tells us immediately is that we can't train an algorithm on one population and necessarily assume that it's going to be effective on the others. And so that's intuitive, where you've got your step count. If you ever worn 2 different activity monitors at the same time, you know that they don't give you the same answer. And you can think about, there's other complicating factors about gait, age, culture, disease. So we took a device and sort of these gray icons of people here, train an algorithm with the f of x, the function, and then we can easily classify the people in the gray, sort of this green box. But what about all the heterogeneity in the human population? And then what if you add on top of that people who are in a different age bracket and also have comorbidities related to different diseases? You pile on top of that the diversity of different types of activity trackers and devices, and then we need to come up with a different way to do this. And what's interesting about this, if you think about the way a person walks, so I walk differently today than I walked as a 20-year-old. And also, if you have a close friend or a family member, and you saw them off in the distance, you could recognize that person mostly just by the way they walk, even if you couldn't see their face or didn't know what they were wearing. And so an algorithm trained on me won't work on you, and vice versa. And so that's where the concept for the personalization comes into mind. And real quick, all we're doing here is something that's you're all very familiar with. Is similar to what Face ID does for when you get a new iPhone. So they trained a face recognition algorithm on millions of faces in their data and public data and other sources that they could get their hands on. And then when you get your new iPhone, you do that little calibration, or what's the deep transfer learning step, where you rotate your head around and it calibrates, so it knows that it's a face, and then it learns the features that make your face different than anybody else's face. And that's the personalization step. And again, so we're using the same deep transfer learning technique that's used by Face ID on your phone. And again, we're just bringing methodologies and technologies to bear that have been established, and we're tweaking them and improving them and customizing to what we need. But we're reusing established techniques here. And so if we augment in cohort 2, where we take 30 seconds of each subject's data in that cohort 2, and we do the deep transfer learning, sort of that Face ID recognition step, if you will, then you can see on the personalized in the column, it snaps back up to very high accurate step count. So this isn't too surprising, but what it does tell you then is that for a clinical trial where it might be very hard to generate a lot of data for, say, a COPD patient that's also got diabetes, that's 78 years old, has a walker, and walks mostly between their bathroom, their living room, and their hallway and their bedroom, that being able to customize an algorithm to that person and the way that person operates in their gait and the way they walk is going to be a significant benefit for our patients and also for our trials, and is pushing us in the direction of being able to use this kind of technology and this kind of passive measurement in our studies. So last slide here, what I want to review is we talked about today's practice and how things are done, and then how we want to innovate and validate. So the innovation is using the technology that is brought to bear by our modern world in the consumer space. And we want to validate that works in the populations that we aim to treat. And the ultimate goal is better outcomes, both for us as an organization, for patients in our trials, and for society at large. And with that, that is my last slide, and I can end there. Thank you. Okay. Any questions? Chat, poll. I don't have a poll. Chat. So I'm going to read, have a question here. So video analysis for ground truthing sounds time consuming. Did you try to automate it, for example, by CNN LSTM? So very good point. So it was time consuming. We did it with brute force. Of course, the grad student did bring up the idea of building an algorithm to classify the images into left step or right step, but we did not get there. Love that idea, though. Great idea. Another question being asked is the AI strategy accepted by FDA for clinical trials? So currently today, the answer is no. There is a regulatory area within the FDA and the EMA that's classified as software as a medical device. So this kind of technology would fall under that area. And companies like AstraZeneca, myself included, in that are actively working on the strategies for monitoring, for approving and monitoring AI in the clinic from a regulatory perspective. So the challenge there is an interesting one, in that how do you validate, and if we get to the true sort of art of AI in the future, where it's actually learning and evolving on its own out in the wild, how do you approve and monitor that? From a regulatory perspective? So unknown answers to those questions. From Arvind Sonawane, how do you see the utility of AI for orphan disease patients? Great lead into orphan diseases. May even have greater utility there, where you need specialization. Beyond that, it would be to see. I'd like to see it, come to fruition and gain some traction in some of the larger disease areas, and then be able to focus in the orphan disease populations. Best way to reach me would be on LinkedIn. From Joseph, I see I missed the first part, so is it still being worked out? Where, what applications could it be used? So this is, the first part is what we're focusing on is around cardiovascular, renal metabolism, and asthma areas, therapeutic areas that are focus areas for AstraZeneca. The idea there is that what is currently accepted today is either a 6-minute walk test or a cycloergometry test, which is site-based. And what we want to do is we want to move into a more passive objective measurement during normal daily living and use personalized AI to do that. Step count is one area, and activity monitoring is only one area where this personalization piece comes in. You know, you think about applications in terms of telehealth, audio and video, AI, that would be relevant for early indications of quality of life changes and safety alerts and signs and symptoms for patients across the healthcare spectrum. Okay, Erica, a couple questions asking about anomaly detection or drift, like for monitoring and diagnosing something like Parkinson's. Yeah, that's a fair point. We currently compartmentalize anomaly detection on sort of data quality coming off a device. We've decoupled that from this work. But it's interesting to think how they would come together and dovetail in practice once these algorithms get to a point where they're approved, and how does that work, particularly in a disease like Parkinson's, which I'm not really thinking about applications there right now. I don't really have a good answer for the anomaly detection or drift. What comes to mind is the site visits will never go away during clinical trials, right? So there's decentralized trials, but there's still going to have to be patient and practitioner sort of touch points. And maybe that's an opportunity to redo the personalization or the calibration should anomalies be noted or there's evidence of drift. For Moshe, how will personalized model be implemented in practice per patient, ground truth, or some supervised? So it's similar, think about it like when you get your iPhone 3 times around the horn with your face. So with a patient, they would have an app, they would have a supervised or a coached 30 seconds of walking or activity, and then the calibration would take place there. And that would be using deep transfer learning in the background, but it's essentially a calibration. You're welcome, Lori. Thank you for participating. Okay, so we're getting a heads up at 1 minute. Eric, and so are you engaged in working with epilepsy? We are not working with epilepsy. I apologize for missing your question earlier. I missed it. Okay. And I'll send, yeah, that really good question. So tying in sort of coaching and behavior modification as almost what is starting to fall under the heading of a digital therapeutic at that point, right? We're actually changing behavior based on outcomes of AI, where there's no human in the loop at all. So that's quite interesting in terms of applications. All right, well, I'm going to keep answering some questions until Morgan kicks me off. It looks like we have some extra time. So I will continue to answer a couple questions till she tells me I'm done. Good question about COVID. So we have a lot of stuff. AstraZeneca has a lot of stuff going on. We are in particular involved with vital sign monitoring with the big U.S. study that's launching this month. Unfortunately, I can't for a variety of reasons. One of which is I just don't know the answer. Anti-COVID medicine, when that's going to be launched. And we will be using analytics and AI for discovery and delivery of new medicines for sure. Drug design, drug target modeling, all of that stuff is a big effort. Actually, AstraZeneca has a huge fleet of talented folks working on that. And we don't work on that at all. And then what recommendations, publications, et cetera, would you recommend for data scientists and analytics professionals interested in healthcare and AI, but working in a different industry? Interesting question. Yeah, let me think on that. Maybe hit me up on LinkedIn and we could start a conversation about that. I think there's many different answers. I don't want to do you injustice or a disservice here by not giving you a good complete answer on that one. The language and the knowledge base behind clinical practice, drug development, clinical trials, you learn through practice. It's not necessarily in textbooks, but what is valuable is the technical sort of hard skills in math and physics and computer science. So if you're bringing those to the table, for me personally, I don't worry too much about someone who's highly technical and got a lot of talent and a lot of passion. On the technical side, I don't worry too much about the biomedical or the healthcare side, because that'll come by being immersed in the industry in those projects. Okay, we're at 1 minute left. Looks like the chat questions have lightened up a little bit. And I wanted to say thank you very much to everyone who took the time to sit in and listen. I hope you found it interesting and about what we shared about what the work that we're doing, and hope to connect with you in some other venue, maybe even in person, some other conference sometime. Thanks so much for your attention. Much appreciated.